freaking excited to bring to you today's guest, my interview with Mr. John McAdory. And he's just a wealth of information and knowledge for not only aspiring CRAs, but all of you current CRAs. And we talk about so many things, from how he went from pre-med to study coordinator to CRA and on to VP. So you definitely want to stay tuned. You definitely want to check this out. If you're a aspiring CRA, a current CRA in the clinical research industry, and hey, this is for you. Check it out. So I really appreciate you doing this. I know how busy you are.
Oh, no.
So I really do appreciate you sharing your story. I really, really do.
Sure. No, this is great. And I'm excited. And you just have me thinking over the last week, really, just how things I can share and just in terms of my journey and thinking about how I got to where I am. And it's exciting. And I think there's a lot of potential opportunity for a lot of people in clinical research, especially people of color, to really have a successful career and be able to find themselves in a niche that they can grow and learn. And it was interesting, we were interviewing CRAs for CRO yesterday. And one of the things that drew me into the industry in general was that I feel like it's one of the few careers where every time you do something, it's completely new. And so you start a trial, you start a study, you get moved to a trial, you get moved to a study, and the fundamentals are the same. But then everything else from there is completely different. Like it's a new therapeutic area. It's working with new colleagues. It's working with new potential sponsors, new CROs. And so you're constantly learning. And I think that's cool in the sense of it never gets stale. Like sometimes you get in this, you're doing the same thing over and over again, but every couple of years, like you're starting over fresh and new, and it kind of keeps you reinvigorated in the drive to keep going. So I think that's something special about our industry, is that projects aren't forever and you're constantly moving to different projects and learning different skill sets and being exposed to different things.
I agree 100%. I guess, where did you go for undergrad? Sure. And what was your major?
Okay. I went to Hampton University undergrad. Go Pirates. There you go. Go Pirates. So I'll take us back. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. I went to Hampton University undergrad. I was a bio pre-med major. And so shortly after, actually the year I graduated, I went back home. And that's when I got exposed into clinical research. But my plan was to go to medical school. And so like many, when you start in college, or you start your major, you kind of have like, I want to do X major so I can do this thing. And so my goal was to become a doctor. Like my father is a physician. He's a family doctor in Miami. I've been exposed to medicine pretty much my whole life. My mom ran his practice. She was a hospital administrator, a teacher, and then ran his practice. So a lot of his business success is directly related to my mother. And so I kind of have this business piece and this medical piece kind of growing up and kind of pushing me along. But yeah, my intent was to become a physician when I graduated from college.
Nice. Obviously, you did not go to medical school. So how did you, what made you say, I don't want to go to medical school? And then what were your kind of like alternatives once you decided that's not the path for me?
So sure. So full transparency, I was a good student. I wasn't the best student. So I wasn't, graduating summa cum laude or anything like that from Hampton. So I was, A's and B's mostly. And so when I graduated, I needed to, take time to study for the MCAT. And I was looking at a post-bac program to be able to prep to go to medical school. And during that time, I went back to Miami after I graduated. And my mother had been talking to my father about starting clinical trials in his practice. And so it was mostly, my father has a practice in his predominantly Black neighborhood in South Florida. And so a lot of it was like hypertension studies and diabetes and some dementia and things like that. And so when I graduated, my parents were like, you need a job. And I was like, well, I'll help you the clinical trials, because I kind of, being bio major, kind of science kind of fit into the thing. When doing it, I was working as a study coordinator, and I was seeing patients, like helping my dad do vital signs and blood pressures and all those things, because that's what I did working in this practice since I was 7 years old. I learned how to do all those things.
Wow.
And then also I was doing the science side of it. So I was filling out the case report forms and working with the IRBs and doing all the different things like that. So it was kind of a meld of different skill sets I had learned, not only in college, but also just working in my father's practice, helping my mom with the business side, but also helping my dad, and playing, the young Dr. John and doing that. So when I got exposed to it, I was kind of like, this is really interesting and it's kind of cool. And like you're helping, you have the scientific aspect of it, but then you have the clinical component. And I just didn't know that existed while I was in school.
Right.
So, like when I was in undergrad or going into medical school, like if you're going to be a bio major, like you're going to either be a bench scientist, a teacher, or a doctor.
Right.
Those are the three things that they kind of instill in you in terms of this is your career choice. There's all kinds of opportunities in medicine, but a lot of times it gets drilled down to these three things.
Right.
And so just getting exposed to it, it just gave me a lens into other opportunities in the clinical and the research and the pharma medical field. And I just started to grow to love it.
Oh, wow. And just out of curiosity, how did your mom find out about clinical research?
So I think she was talking to another predominantly white practice, and they in the same office building, and they have started to do clinical trials. And one thing, and this kind of goes into probably the story of my success, things like that, is my mother always looked at what other successful practices, what other successful people were doing, and then tried to see, can I bring that here? And so a lot of times and so from that, we were one of the early adopters and one of the few my father was one of the few Black investigators in Miami, because the exposure into Black practices wasn't there, to the point where my father is a very big advocate for finding Black investigators. The National Medical Association, they started initiatives to be able to identify Black investigators, because a lot of practices, you have the insurancing patients, but they use this as a secondary revenue stream. Mm-hmm. And there's opportunities for this. The FDA wants more Black investigators because they realize there's a disparity in the number of Black patients participating in clinical trials. And even if you look at things with the COVID, and I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but things with the COVID, when they're like, we're doing clinical trials, in the Black and brown community, because of historical things that have happened, there's an inherent distrust of taking new medications and or even participating in clinical trials. I remember when, Meharry and Fisk and some of the Black medical schools and institutions and the Black chancellors from the heads of the schools were saying, I'm going to participate in the clinical trial. I'm going to participate in the vaccine, get vaccinated. There was a big backlash about that. But I think a lot of it is, if you don't have representation from the medical side, the medical community, and participating in clinical trials, then people are unaware and don't see all the great things that are happening and all the strides they've taken to ensure informed consent, ensure what's happening, ensure what's going on. I mean, medical has an inherent distrust across the board in multiple communities, but the lack of disparity and the lack of representation leads to distrust. And I think that's, I've been doing this for 20 years and it really hasn't changed at that level where you're seeing more Black investigators, where we're starting to see more women investigators, which is great, because like that representation matters, because then when things come to market or questions are asked, you have someone that you trust that looks like you to be able to ask these questions to. But so there needs to be work there in order to help bridge that gap. But yes, my mom, she found out about clinical trials. She applied to reached out to PPD and applied for trials, and they came and did a qualification visit. My dad got selected as an investigator. Wow.
So your mom was like way ahead of the game.
Yeah. So this was probably I'm really about to date myself. So this was probably 1999. So yes. So I don't, it was funny. There was a meme on Instagram where the checkout clerk was checking someone out, and they're like, and someone's buying alcohol, and they're like, and the guy reached for his ID. He's like, no, I'm good. And he was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, your birth year started with a 1, so you're fine. And so, because at this point, anybody that starts with a 1 is 21 years old. So he was like, "Oh, you're good. You start with the one." So that's how we did ourselves now.
That's funny. Wow. And I know this is kind of off topic too, but it goes to what you said. Now that you mentioned it, I have never, as a study coordinator, as a monitor, in the industry in general, I have never, even when I was on the preclinical side, there was maybe one principal investigator that he wasn't like the head of the study, so to speak. It wasn't really like a sub-I either. It was kind of like a collaboration type of thing. But I have never met a Black PI. Never said that. I didn't even think about that, but I have never met one.
Right. And so it's a thing that needs to be addressed. I know, and just talking to my father and being close with the NMA, there was probably in the early 2000s, one of the concerns was there was a big drop off in African-American attendance to medical schools, especially African-American males. And so there was a big initiative with a lot of medical schools that actually tried to encourage more African-American students to apply and go to medical school. And so that may be something systemic in it. And, you're losing, as like generations like my father retire and the new generations come in. But there's also, I think, also in the business of medicine, there are other opportunities that aren't so clinical based that I think people are taking advantage of as well. Different speaking roles, being on advisory panels, advisory boards, where you're not necessarily stuck into the clinic, but in terms of like acute care, like general medicine and internists and things like that, I think there's been a drop off in those specialties in medical school across the board, and then tie into the lack of Black and brown students actually going to medical school. So there's a issue across the board in terms of long-term care of how to find like general practitioners, family physicians, internists to actually care for us when we get, 60, 70 years old, because there are not that many people going into that specialty anymore.
That's true. So true. And then, transitioning back into clinical research, do you think that has something to do with it? Now people are becoming more aware of the clinical research options and that more appealing?
I think so. I think because, if you break it down, and I had, when I was making this decision, like I was having these conversations with my father and both with my parents and looking at like, how do you make a decision to say like, my whole life was, I was going to be a doctor. I was going to take over my father's practice. And that was going to be the path I was set on. And, you start to look at it, but I think there are also difficulties in just managed care. So there is being a doctor, and then there is running a physician's practice. And there are a lot of, and it's not discourage anyone, but just being transparent, and talking to them, like early on when I was talking to my father, like the insurance, dealing with insurance companies, reimbursement, managing staff, there's a lot more. And then you probably talk to a lot of doctors about it. There's a lot more in terms of the bureaucracy and business of healthcare that take more time than they actually do seeing patients. And so a lot of them, there's always this yin and yang. So going to your point where like, if I can go into an industry and a career where I can be, go to medical school, I can be a physician, I can be a medical director, or, look at a safety net or something like that. And I don't have to deal with so much of the bureaucracy where I'm looking at patient files, patient charts, even being an investigator where all you're doing is clinical trials. So all you're doing is seeing patients and, recommending, following them and tracking them, things like that, where you don't have to deal with so much of the bureaucracy of managed care. I think there are pros to that I think people are looking at where they may not want to, may not want to treat. Remember when I first started working from Quintiles, there was a Black guy. He had just graduated from Howard Medical School. And so, like I said, graduated from medical school. He was about 3 months out. And I was like, why aren't you practicing? He was like, he had realized during his residency. So this is the easy part of medical school, or the easier part of medical school. During his residency, he realized like he didn't like caring for patients. So he had gone through undergrad, probably had exposure to being a doctor, shadowing physicians, doing all these things, got all the way to his residency, realized he was like, I don't like treating patients, and pivoted that into a a medical monitoring role at Quintiles, and now he's on to a medical director and senior medical director, and then he wants to eventually become a CMO, but he's never actually practiced medicine. And so I think if you look at things like that, there are this industry lends itself to the opportunities that I didn't know, and I've just seen and having conversations with people that happen over their career. But caveat to that is we do need physicians. So I want to encourage you, if you are going to medical school, go to medical school, because we do need physicians. And I'm always looking from my standpoint. I was talking to some of my staff this past week about finding some additional representation in our investigator pool. Like, how can we find more female investigators? How can we find more investigators of color to have more representation? Because, like I said earlier, the FDA wants diversity of patients, right? Because studies show like medications don't work the same in all ethnicities, in all places. So you need that. So it's important to have that diversity of patients to truly know how effective a product is when it's being approved.
Right. I agree 100%. Wow. So you got off to a great start. And like myself, I didn't find out about the clinical research side really until like graduate school. So, obviously you did not choose that medical school route and you decided the clinical research route. So what kind of pushed you into the CRA direction? You mentioned working with your parents at your dad's office. So that obviously, sparked an interest in clinical research in general. But why the CRA role?
So when I was working as study coordinator, so I was reviewing the case report forms. There were CRAs, monitors coming into the practice and into our site, and they were, reviewing everything and, issuing queries and things like that. And so they were mostly, retired nurses. So people in their, 50s, not even 60s, but most people in their 50s, they were retired nurses. And so in my mind, I didn't, and this also goes to another thing of just not knowing, like, I didn't know like what happens after the site. So like, I didn't have any insight into anything else happening beyond that. And so, but, you talk to them and, ask what they did. And then, they're all coming from in and out of town and traveling down to our site in Florida. And probably about, I don't know, a year in, our monitor, as happens in most cases, monitors end up switching and switching sites. Or I think she was actually retiring. She was retiring. And she's like, I'm gonna, you have a new monitor coming to the site. And I was like, okay. And, we exchanged emails and we talked on the phone. And so then our new monitor came and she was 24. And so I was like, you're not a retired nurse. And so like at that point, like I probably had, with all the studies we worked on, I probably had at least 10 monitors come to my site and they're all 50-year-old retired nurses. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. But like for me as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old guy thinking like, what I want to do, like I'm doing this as a bridge until like I'm going to go to medical school. And then comes someone my age who is a monitor. So then I was like, okay. So then I started picking her brain about like, how did you do this? Or what's this? I thought you had to be a nurse and I thought you had to have all this clinical experience and all these things in order to be. And she was like, no, she started study coordinator and then started working with, that was PPD at the time. And she had started got hired by PPD as a coordinator because they were trying to get younger CRAs. Mm. And so they were working with sites to start trying to find people. So then I started doing more research on clinical research associates. And to be honest, other thing cool, it was she was in Philadelphia and traveling to Miami. So I was like, that's actually pretty cool. Like I have a traveling job. I can, go all these cool places and do things. I started to apply for CRA roles and I got hired by a small biotech out of Princeton, New Jersey called Theradex. And I was working as a CRA for them. And I ended up actually relocating from Miami to Atlanta. And that's when I was having conversations about like, this may be the career path that I want to go and pursue. And so kind of led me down that line in terms of becoming a CRA. And I loved it. I was immediately started working on oncology studies. And so like, next thing you know, like you're doing cancer research and non-small cell lung cancer. and you're trying to come up with treatments, and you're seeing, but again, at the site level, when you're going in as a monitor, you're still reviewing patient charts. Right. You're still looking at the data, and you still have that clinical science aspect of it so I didn't feel like I was missing out on some of my passions, because I was still going into the hospitals and talking to the doctors and the physicians, and that just felt natural to me. And so it helped me kind of drive and find that lane. And so CRA, like when I became a CRA, it just felt real like this is a natural path for me to be going down.
Wow. Nice. And so it sounds like for you, your transition was pretty smooth, would you say, from study coordinator to CRA? Yeah,
it took about a year. A lot of applying. It took about a year, a lot of interviewing people, because a lot of it was people still wanted people to actually have like clinical degrees. So, I was being persistent though. Like I was going to continue to drive and push and figure it out. Like I didn't get hired by any of the big CROs or any of the big pharmas. Like it was a small company. They were looking for help in they're based in New Jersey. They're looking for help in South Florida, and I just in an emergency type need, and so I kind of fit in. Like it was me applying and a circumstance kind of met, and so it actually got my foot in the door, because I know a lot of times it's that first step of trying to come from a study coordinator to a CRA in our industry is a huge hurdle, and people have try to traverse that for years. Jasmine, probably some of your experiences, that's a hard step to get to, because people just I haven't figured out what it is to make that transition and why people are apprehensive of hiring from the site level coming over, because most people in our industry did work at the site at some point.
Right.
So, but that's a hard step. But I think the circumstance led to me actually getting my foot into the door. But it was about a year of me applying and not getting the jobs before that opportunity actually came up.
Nice. So a year is a lot of people I speak with. They're like, I want to become a CRA in 3 months, 6 months, but a year is pretty fast, honestly.
Yeah,
that's a pretty good, time frame to transition. And to just kind of touch on what you said about why it's so hard. So based off of my conversations with some of the hiring managers and, directors and stuff like that with the larger CROs, at least for them, they find a challenge of getting the new CRAs on studies. Because, even though they hire them, the sponsors still have to give approval. So there was
I'm guilty of that. You're right.
See?
You're right. You're right. Like you had to have 3 years, you need to have all this and all this. Yeah. You're right.
See, you're part of the problem.
Okay. You got it.
But yeah, there was one point where they had like a full class of CRA ones, and they couldn't get them on any study. It took almost 2 years to get everybody on a study. And that's crazy, right? Because they've been trained, but the sponsors still have to approve it. And then another layer is the turnover rate. There's a lot of people that say they want to be a CRA, and then they get the job, and then they start the training, and they're like, what did I get myself into? So a lot of people, they barely make that 6-month mark, and even a lot around that 3-month mark, they drop off.
No, and I think that's an important point, because we're talking about success in doing this, but it's a ton of work. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of things that people just don't realize. And I feel like some of it is you end up, you go through. I've got some of the best training out there. I went through Quintile's entire training. I went through PPD's entire training, PRA's, all I work with some of the biggest CROs in the world. You do all this training and you get there, and, part of it is the human element of dealing with people. Part of it is, depending on the type of studies you're on, you're dealing with older patients who don't remember, and they're, so there are gaps in data. And then on top of that, I touched on this earlier, when I was when I was in my young 20s, I was like, I love traveling. Like, I was like, I lived in, like I said, I relocated to Atlanta, but I would spend a week in LA going to 3 sites and monitoring. I was like, on a company's, on a per diem. So I was like, oh, this is the best job ever. I was like, I'm literally traveling this United States, going to some best cities and doing all these things. And so that was 23-year-old me. Fast forward to 27, 28-year-old me. And I'm waking up in the hotel and have no clue where I am because I've been in 3 cities. I've been in 3 cities in the same week. And I'm just like on 3 different flights, 3 cities. I left Monday. It's Thursday. I haven't been home. And I'm like, wait, where am I? Like,
I've done that too.
I did the exact same thing. And so like week in and week out doing this, and you're just like, okay, like I'm looking at like the area code on the phone to say like, okay, I'm in Tampa. It's like, oh, that's Dr. So-and-so. I was like, okay, that's what I'm here to do. Because like I didn't land until 11 o'clock and now I'm up at 7:30 trying to eat breakfast to get to the site by 8:30, 9 o'clock in order to monitor for 9 hours and then get on the plane and jump and go somewhere else. And so like, it's fun, but it's tons of work. And I think and like I said, I haven't been CRA for a while. So I don't know the travel woes, but I know like working with my CRAs now, like the site logistics and things that you guys that have to deal with is pain. Is like, it's hard, mental, tiring work. And so I can see where people kind of get into like, oh no, this is not quite. there's a high burnout rate and turnover because it is. But if you, and kind of know that into my career path, if you can figure it out and navigate through the first 3-4 years, and then you kind of figure out like, okay, what I want to do next. And I think a lot of natural progression is people going into doing this as an independent contractor. So you can start working directly with a CRO or a biotech, and you're a salaried employee and you're getting the benefits and everything there. But I think the real opportunity, especially for us as people of color, and because we have an entrepreneurial mindset, and you're able to start essentially your own independent business.
Yep.
And then I think all the hard work you put over your first 3 to 5 years really starts to reward itself, because you're able to kind of be selective on the contracts you want to take. Right. You're able to garner a higher rate because you've gone through the gauntlet and got this experience. And then you're actually being rewarded, and then you have a business, and then, like having an LLC, and that's how you're making your primary income. There are different tax things you can look at. Like, there's a lot of opportunity there to really bridge out and just have a consultancy in the clinical research arena, where a lot of people stay CRAs, but then you can actually be a consultant project manager and be a consultant, in safety and different opportunities that may open up along the way. So I think it's just getting through, like, one is getting in the door. And then 2, it's getting through the first, few years and establishing yourself as someone who is well thought of in the industry. And then you can start your own business or continue on a career path and trajectory. I started as CRA, and then with Theradex, but then Quintiles hired me, and I was working with Quintiles, and I transitioned over to PPD, I think. So it was Quintiles a couple of years at PPD. And my goal was to, and as most CRAs, is try to figure out like, how can I leave the CRO world and move over into pharma, and work with a pharma company versus as a CRO. And so, and that opportunity actually happened for me at Amgen. And so in 2006, I was able to transition over into Amgen and work as a CRA on the pharma side, which is the job and function of the job and everything is the same, except it's a lot of, so if you look at the structure, is the pharma sits on top. So they call all the shots. It's their drug, it's their product, right. It's simply their staff that they have. And then they outsource certain aspects of the clinical research or clinical trials to CROs, which are contract research organizations. And so they outsource those to those. And so it's, in my mind, it's always better to be on the decision maker side than on the person who's being told what to do. That's just my mindset. And so like a lot of people want to get to the pharma side, and also there are benefits to being on a pharma. These are, Fortune 500 companies. You get large options and salaries and different things like that. So I got to Amgen, and that's kind of actually, there were several inflection points during my Amgen tenure, but that was the ultimate goal in my first few years of being a CRA, was how do I get, hired by a pharma and then, or biotech, and work on that side versus working on the CRO side.
So you had like a really great transition from because all of those CROs you mentioned are at the top, like you said,
Right.
And then even the pharma companies. And that all started with that one after the study coordinator opportunities, that all started with the Theradex opportunity, which a lot of people they reach out and they have questions about starting with some of the smaller companies because they aren't quite sure if that will get them to their goal. But I mean, you're a perfect example of, it doesn't matter how you get your start. You just have to.
You need to get the start. You need, it's one of those things, like once you have the title, like that's the most important thing.
Yep.
That's the most important thing. And then if you're new to this and you're looking at or your experience, you're trying to figure out how to traverse through your career. One, figure out how to get the title. Two, if you can figure out how to work on an oncology study, then a lot of your career, even if it's only a couple of years and you end up transitioning back to a non-oncology study, those two things are probably the most important thing if you really want to really drive success in what it is you do. I've pretty much on my 20-year career, I would say 17 have been dealing with oncology studies almost exclusively. I remember taking a break because oncology studies are very, very complex. They're very hard. It's a lot of driven. And then, you don't ever, I remember, because it was a site, I was living in Atlanta, but there was a site in actually Miami at that was monitoring at, and you review the charts and okay, this person has a terminal illness and you're giving them treatment and you see them getting better. But most of the time it's only over a period of time until they progress again. Right. And so you see the patient's charts and you talk to coordinators. And so you start to feel like this person. Like you're reading, like you start feeling empathy and compassion towards this person who's taking your drug that's being treated, and they're making decisions and doing different things. Like I know, one of them was a younger patient, like in his 40s. He had developed lung cancer, which is very, very rare. And he was taking the drug, but the side effects and adverse events from the drug were actually preventing him from working. So he literally was making a decision over getting cancer treatment or being able to actually work and provide for his family, because he had his own business. And so basically if he wasn't working, he could not support his family. Right. But if he wasn't receiving the cancer treatment, it's, lung cancer is a terminal illness. So you're seeing there and you see the coordinator was very good in documenting conversations, and I would talk to her about it. You hear this yin and yang happening with that. And you can just imagine how he was dealing with this and feel compassion for him. But yeah, it's very, it's very, very complex, because, a lot of times you're dealing with people who are ultimately going to pass. Right. And so the goal is, as best you can, you're looking for a cure or for a treatment to help extend, survival. And, people get excited doing cancer research when, the survival is extended for 6 months, and you're kind of like, that's it. But when you realize that's 6 more months that person has with their family, with their kids, with their loved ones. And so we're making incremental progress in terms of how treatments are working. But, that's another more human aspect of what it is you do. That's even going back to my story I was saying before, building the clinical stuff, that's kind of pieces that were drawing me in, because you still get that. You don't ever see the patient. You don't get a lot of talk to the patient, but you can still garner in from the nose, talking to the physicians, talking to the nurses, what's going on with that patient's life. And you kind of imagine and put a story around it, which for me was nice, where it wasn't just pushing a lot of paper.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes with oncology, it's been hard for me though, because I have a pediatric oncology study. So seeing the little babies that are sick is very tough. And then there was a young mom, I think she was 29 or 30. She got breast cancer and it was not going well. She was not responding at all.
Right.
Ultimately passed, and then you have to you have a monitoring visit. They're still alive. You come back, they're not, and sometimes it's tough. But like you said, that does give you like the best of both worlds because you have like the research, the data, and all that stuff. But then you still have that clinical aspect, even though you don't get to talk to the patients directly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of what drew me into like the combination of everything. And then I wanted to touch on the fact that you said, you went from one large CRO to another. I'll get people that, they reach out and they really want to know, like they're already at maybe a major CRO or pharma even, and they want to know, like, when do you know that it's time to get that next role or, go to another CRO? And then why? Because they're like, it's going to be the same
Right.
job. So why would you leave? Why not, invest more time and energy and effort and kind of trying to, advance within that company versus leaving?
Sure.
So what kind of made you leave?
So I want to come up with a very profound, deep answer. However, it's going to come down to dollars and cents. It's kind of where things fall. It's going back to some of the conversations we had earlier. If you become a CRA and then you have oncology experience, then you become a demand commodity, a highly demanded commodity. So like you talked about before, the CROs, they hire these people and people are coming out of CRA ones and they don't have this experience and they can't get placed onto because their recruiters are calling people like me who they've been tracking over the last 2 years and 2 or 3 years and say like, oh, well, we're going to keep track of John. Let's call John. John, are you still doing oncology? Yes. Are you still this place? Yes. Okay. So you're checking all like John has 3 years of this. John has 3 years of this. John has 3 years of this. We need to pull John into our CRA pool. And in order to pull John over, like, John, what are you making now? Oh, well, we can give you $10,000 to $15,000 more if you come work with us. And it sounds bad in business sense, but when you're transitioning, that's where a lot of the transition and turnover happen is these recruiters track you in your progress of your career over time, both in-house at the CROs and external independent recruiters. And they'll know like, okay, so they'll look at your profile and be like, okay, Jasmine's been doing this. She's at 10 years now. Mm-hmm. Is she still, okay, so she should be at 7 years in oncology and this. I have a client or a sponsor that's looking for Jasmine. Let me call Jasmine and say like, hey, like, what are you doing now? How are you, are you looking? Do you want to do something? Are you looking? We have an opportunity for you. Here are the details for it. Like, what do you want to do? And then, so you have to make a decision. Some of my early mentors, one of the things that I think I was fortunate with, especially working at Quintiles early on, is that a lot of the CRAs that I ended up working with were African-American women that literally adopted me. And they were like, you need to get this right. She was like, because one, there hardly any I was the only male on my team, let alone the African-American male. So they're like, you can't, they will call me. They're like, you're messing up, John. Yeah. They were like, you need to get it together. But we're talking with them. And I encourage that, find yourself a mentor in whatever industry you're in. You need to have a mentor in that space that successfully traversed all the things that you can go and ask the questions to. And, and that's one of the things that I was fortunate enough to have earlier on in my career. And I continue to find mentors in the space that I can reach out to and say like, hey, like I'm running into this problem, or how did you deal with this? Or, both from an HR or business perspective or just personal work-life balance. Like you need to have people that are ahead of you in terms of where you want to go that you can talk to and lean on. So in talking to them. And so I asked them about their careers and where they weren't, because like they have been doing this 10 more years more than I had. So I asked them. And so like you start to see a trend where people kind of traverse through the different CROs, but ultimately it gives you several things. And it gives you different aspects into training, different aspects into systems, and different opportunities to work with different sponsors, because a lot of times sponsors have their preferred CROs. So like if you're working on with X sponsor, the likelihood is their CRO is going to be this CRO.
Right.
And they're not going to, except in some rare circumstances, they're not going to be working at a different one. So there's a lot of, especially early 2000s, third and mid 2000s, there's a lot of jockeying going back and forth because oncology was becoming very big business. Mm-hmm. So the Amgens of the world were working with quintiles, and the Genentechs were working with PPDs. And so like you're trying to, they are, and basically in order to keep and sustain their business with these huge biotechs that are starting to bring in billions of dollars because they're on the next generation of cancer treatments, they're constantly recruiting you to come over to come do their studies because they need to present you as a CRA that has 3 years of oncology experience, worked on this type of trial to them because they don't necessarily have those because turnover is so much. They don't necessarily have those. And so it's still like that 20 years later in the oncology field where if you have oncology experience, like there's a market and a job for you. You know, if you're good at your job, sometimes you don't even have to be great at your job, just good at your job. And there's a market for you because there are hundreds and hundreds of oncology studies starting up every single year. And it's just getting bigger as you start moving into immunotherapies, checkpoint inhibitors, some of the other therapeutics that are coming down the line that they'll just continue to increase. But going back to your question, a lot of times it was a financial decision. And then working with a new sponsor, different type of trial, and then you're able to find different opportunities. My goal is always to find a place where I can sit and traverse and move up a more traditional career path. Yeah. But sometimes in the CRA model, it doesn't always fit that way because like a study stops, ends, you may end up on, God forbid you end up on a SWAT team and and they're like, just go do this visit here to keep you busy.
And for the people that don't know, explain what a SWAT visit is.
Okay, so basically, if you're so you're laughing because we've been there. So basically, if you work at a CRO, your study ends and they don't have a place to send you yet. You end up on a SWAT team. And I don't even know what the acronym means, but basically is you are catching all things. So a lot of times if say a study is ramping up and they have X many sites that need to be initiated in the month of March, but they only have 2 CRAs working on that study and they have 10 SIVs. So they know they can't do that. So they don't need you on this study forever. They just need you to go do 3 SIVs this month. So basically they hand you the protocol. They say, read this, here are the slides, go through these 3 visits, and then you're good. So in the next week, they're like, can you go co-monitor on this other study that you don't know, and you don't know these people, you're not on the study. They hand you a protocol. They're like, go over there and help do regulatory review at this person here. Hey, like we need you to go do a PSV. And they hand you a protocol synopsis, hand you some slides, and they say, go here and go do this thing. Or can you come in-house and help us clean the ETMF? And they fly you in and you sit in a room and all you're doing is helping clean up the ETMF or the TMF files. So SWAT means you do pretty much whatever they ask because you're not assigned to anything. Yeah. And so it's, some people, I know a person that prefers to be on SWAT. So they're not dedicated to any sponsor, XYZ. They're a contractor, and he's like, it's constant work. He was like, they send me, I get paid. And they're like, I don't have to worry about dealing with the sponsors and all the other stuff that happen to it. I know another guy, like he's dedicated only to study startup. He's only the study startup CRA. So all he does is fly around and do PSVs. And that's all he wants to do. He doesn't want to do any other monitoring, don't want to do anything. So he's very, very good at it. He's one of the best CRAs I've ever seen for site selection ever. But that's his niche. He's like, my goal is to get the site up. And once it's up, that's all I'm good. That's all I want to do. And I try to recruit him. It's like, hey, like, do you want to just be a regular monitor? He's like, that's not what I do. He's like, I do startup. He's like, this is what I do well. I got a process in place. I can get all this stuff. The site gets trained well and we're good. So like, that's his bread and butter niche. So like you can find different niches, but end up on a SWAT team. If it's not your intent, is just a lot of busy work. You're actually at the whim and mercy of the CRA manager because it's just, you're not on a study. So you're basically doing whatever the company asks you to do. Right. at a drop. A lot of times it can be drop it down nose. Like I remember it was a cool trip because I didn't know, but I ended up going to Rapid City, South Dakota. And I didn't know that that's where Mount Rushmore was. But, they called me on Wednesday and they were like, you to be in South Dakota on Friday. And I was like, isn't that like Canada? Like, it's like, who's in South Dakota? And so I landed and I go into the airport and I pull my, get the rental car, drive out, and they're like Mount Rushmore, like 3 miles to the right, and the hospital's like 7 miles to the left. I was like, wait, Mount Rushmore's here? And so I did a drive by Mount Rushmore and saw the monument, took a picture from my car and did the visit. But like it's stuff like that. It's not, you're basically, because they know you're not working, you can't really say no because you're at the mercy of the company. And so, sorry, that just racked a whole bunch of memories.
Oh, no, that's great. That's great. And it's good that you pointed out that you can create a niche within the CRA role. Yes. A lot of people don't talk about that either. They think,
and I think that's the cool thing. Like it's your, like you have to define and come up with your path you want to choose. And the way the models work, a lot of times different CROs have different models in terms of how they do things. Like some have a dedicated study startup team. So all these people are proficient and they perfected a model within that CRO of how to identify a site, get the site through the regulatory process to where the site is initiated and then it's handed off.
Right.
And to the point where even a lot of the larger medical institutions are developing that model. Like I know at some of the cancer centers in Florida, like you have someone that only works with you during study startup. Right. And so once the coordinator gets through there, they're done. And so the handover can be difficult because you're communicating for 3 to 4 months with a single person. And then they're like, okay, now you need to go talk to this because as of today, I don't know, I can't help you with your study any longer. So sometimes transitions are a little tricky, but I think things are starting to bubble up to where our models are starting to form where you're going to have more siloed niche type things where people are going to be doing a certain thing. Even when you get to study closeout, the CRAs for closeout may be different because spending if you have a good CRA and they're doing a bunch of closeout visits, you can actually move them onto another sponsor and utilize their talents for actual monitoring and interim monitoring visits and then have a team that's just dedicated to doing closeouts. Right. So I think you're going to start to see where the different phases of the clinical trial are going to start being managed by different personnel that are proficient in that particular phase.